After completing this lesson, you will be able to list, access, and explain the purpose of the various tools used during the initial setup process, explain the overall flow of the initial setup process, access the BIG-IP serial console, and set a new IP address, netmask, and gateway for the BIG-IP management port. Now that Bob is familiar with the hardware, he's wondering what he should do first. Do I have to install any software? No, BIG-IP is shipped with the software already loaded onto it. Only when you upgrade do you have to install software. Does BIG-IP have a default IP address? The BIG-IP management port does have a default IP address, but you can change it if you want. We'll cover that in detail in just a moment. Does BIG-IP have a default network route? No, BIG-IP does not have an initial default route. This is an important step to complete during the initial setup process. We'll talk about this in a minute. Do I need a special key or a license? Yes, you do. None of the software on BIG-IP is available until you activate it. It is the licensing process that accomplishes this, and in the future, when you perform software upgrades, you'll need to reactivate the license. Let's review the overall setup process. There are 3 basic steps. The first step is optional but typically performed. During the first step, you set the IP address, netmask, and optionally the default route for the management port if the default IP address is not appropriate for your network. The second step is to license the system. After connecting BIG-IP to the network, you need a valid license to activate the software. This enables the features you purchased. And the third step is to configure the administrator access to the BIG-IP. This includes setting the root and web administrator passwords, as well as optionally defining various network and VLAN settings. You and Bob will be using several utilities and tools during the setup process. Click each tab to learn about each one. To establish a remote session to the BIG-IP's management. To establish a serial connection between your PC and the BIG-IP. To configure the IP address of the management port, as well as other network parameters, you'll use either a BIG-IP command line configuration script, which is already loaded on the system, or the LCD panel on the hardware. In this course, we'll focus on the configuration script. For a better view of the configuration script interaction, click the graphic below. To license the system and configure the management access parameters, you'll use the BIG-IP web-based configuration utility. In fact, you'll be using the web configuration utility a lot throughout this course, as it's the primary vehicle. Bob began thinking about all of the information he would need before setting up BIG-IP. Seems to me there's going to be a lot of data to remember. IP addresses, network routes, usernames, passwords, VLAN names and numbers. Is there an easy way to plan and keep track of all this data? Yes, there is. F5 Networks provides an easy-to-use LTM configuration worksheet to help you to plan and prepare for your initial BIG-IP LTM setup. We recommend using this worksheet before beginning the setup process. A copy of this worksheet is contained in the above attachments. When you're ready to continue, click the arrow at the bottom of the screen. Let's begin with the details of the first setup task, setting the IP address of the BIG-IP management port. By default, the BIG-IP address is 192.168.1.245. The default netmask is 255.255.255.0. There is no default network route. Although you can use the default IP address, most people change it. It is important to set this address, as well as the netmask and route, prior to licensing the system. BIG-IP offers 2 approaches for configuring this information, the command line or the LCD panel on the hardware. In this module, we'll focus on the command line approach. Click each number below for details on each step of the IP command line configuration process. Note that each step includes a relevant screenshot. You can enlarge the image by clicking it. To change the IP address, netmask, and default route of BIG-IP, you'll need to access the system via the serial console. To do so, connect a null modem cable between the BIG-IP console port. Using your serial terminal client, open a serial connection. Log in as the root user with a password of default. To run the configuration script, type config at the command line. As the script prompts you, type the appropriate system IP address, netmask, and default route. The configuration script displays the choices you have made. Confirm or change the values. This concludes Lesson 2. Before continuing, test your understanding of the content presented in this lesson by answering a few review questions. To BIG-IP over your network, you can move to the second step of the setup process, licensing the system. The licensing process activates the BIG-IP software components that you purchased. This is the topic of the next lesson. Lesson 3, Licensing BIG-IP. After completing this lesson, you'll be able to explain the purpose of licensing the BIG-IP, understand the difference between the automatic and manual licensing methods and when you should use one over the other, access the BIG-IP system and log in via the BIG-IP web configuration utility, and understand the purpose of the registration key and dossier in the licensing system. Bob is also about to license his system, and he's considering a potential problem. He knows that his company, Termark Limited, has a firewall setup that does not allow outbound traffic from the BIG-IP address. With no outbound internet connectivity, he wonders how BIG-IP can obtain the license from the F5 license server. To address this situation, BIG-IP offers two licensing methods, automatic and manual. If your BIG-IP has internet access, you can use the automatic method. If, however, like Bob, your BIG-IP does not have direct internet access or is blocked by a firewall, you'll need to use the manual method. Let's take a look at how each method works. Using the automatic method, BIG-IP handles the licensing process for you. To use this method, you select the appropriate box in the web configuration utility. At that point, BIG-IP generates what is called a dossier. The dossier contains hardware information from your system, as well as the registration key, which is pre-populated on new BIG-IP systems. BIG-IP then sends the dossier to the F5 license server. If the dossier is valid, the license server sends a license file back to BIG-IP. BIG-IP stores the bigip.license file in the /config directory, and you're ready to go. The manual method involves a few additional steps. To use this method, you select the Manual checkbox in the Web Configuration utility. BigIP generates a dossier just as in the automatic method. However, when using the manual licensing method, you either copy the dossier or download it as a file to your PC. If your current PC does not have an outbound connection to the Internet, you then copy the dossier to a PC that does have one. You need this connection to communicate with the F5 license server. You then send the dossier from the PC to the license server. The license server returns the appropriate license file. You then copy the license file to the BigIP, and you're ready to go. Let's take a look at these steps in more detail. Regardless of which licensing method you choose, the first step is to access the BigIP. You do this by connecting to the IP address that you configured for the BigIP management port. Be sure to use HTTPS for this connection. Note that the first time during any browser session that you connect to BigIP, the web browser alerts you that BigIP's security certificate is not known. This is normal behavior. The BigIP system creates a self-signed certificate as part of the setup utility. The handling of self-signed certificates varies across different web browsers. Of the options provided by your web browser, select the one that accepts BigIP certificate and continues to the Web Configuration utility. The login screen for the Web Configuration utility appears next. The next step is to log in to the BigIP configuration utility. The default username is admin, and the default password is also admin. After entering the appropriate credentials, click the Login button. If a BigIP is not licensed, the configuration utility displays the Activate button. Click this button to kick off the licensing process. The next step is to verify the existence of or enter the registration key. As long as the registration key file exists in the BigIP file system, the base registration key field is pre-populated. Otherwise, you'll need to obtain your registration key and enter it manually. You then choose the licensing method you wish to use, automatic or manual, and click Next. If you choose the automatic method, BigIP takes over at this point and completes the licensing process for you. The next slide illustrates what happens when you choose the manual method. When you select the manual method, BigIP builds a dossier and displays it in the user interface. You then follow the steps that were outlined earlier. We'll go through them one more time, this time illustrating what happens in the Web Configuration utility. The next step is to copy the dossier to your PC. You can do this by selecting Copy/Paste Text and then copying the dossier to your clipboard, or you can select Download/Upload File and then copy the dossier to a file on your PC. Connect your PC to the Internet if it's not connected already. Send the dossier to the F5 license server. You can do this by clicking the link in the user interface or by accessing the server directly at activate.f5.com. The F5 license server creates and displays the appropriate license for your BigIP system. You then copy and paste the license information into BigIP and click Next to complete the process. If any of these steps are not clear to you at this point, don't worry. In just a moment, you can watch a video of the entire licensing process, which should help answer any questions you may have. When the licensing process completes successfully, BigIP displays a Configuration Changes Verified message. At this point, you should reboot the system. Remember that, regardless of whether you use the automatic or manual method, you need to reboot or restart services for the license to take effect. The next slide presents a video of the manual licensing process. When you are ready to view the video, click the arrow below. When you select the manual method, BigIP builds a dossier and displays it in the user interface. You then follow the steps that were outlined earlier. We'll go through them one more time, this time illustrating what happens in the Web Configuration utility. When the licensing process completes successfully, BigIP displays a Configuration This concludes Lesson 3. Before continuing, test your understanding of the content presented in this lesson by answering a few review questions. Now that you have licensed your BIG-IP, you can move to the third and final step of the initial setup process, configuring administrator access. This is the topic of the next lesson. Lesson 4. Configuring administrative access. After completing this lesson, you'll be able to explain the purpose of and navigate within the BIG-IP setup utility, configure the administrative settings for accessing BIG-IP, configure settings for the virtual LANs or VLANs and other important network settings, explain the purpose of and navigate within the BIG-IP web configuration utility, and perform a backup of the configuration file containing the settings just mentioned. After the licensing process completes, BIG-IP automatically launches the setup utility, which is actually a component of the overall web configuration utility. The primary purpose of the setup utility is to configure administrative access for the BIG-IP. You can configure the password for the root user of the command line interface and for the admin user of the web interface. You can also configure a host name for the BIG-IP, as well as a variety of other settings. After completing this screen, click Next to continue with your configuration. A screen appears offering you a choice between performing basic network configuration or exiting the setup utility and manually configuring network settings in the web configuration utility. Basic network configuration allows you to create two VLANs, internal and external, and then assign IP addresses and interfaces to both VLANs. Click Next to continue with the basic network configuration. The first configuration screen is for the internal VLAN. You can assign self-IP addresses and net masks for your internal VLANs. Note the port lockdown field. Port lockdown is a security feature that allows you to limit which ports are listening on the self-IP address. From this screen, you can also configure interfaces and VLAN tags if needed. And if redundant pair was specified, a floating IP address and a failover peer. Clicking Next displays an almost identical screen for configuring the external VLAN. Once you have configured both VLANs, the initial setup is complete. After completing the setup utility, BIG-IP automatically displays the welcome screen for the web configuration utility, which provides detailed information and F5 resources to help you get started using BIG-IP. Let's review the functionality of this utility in a little more detail and take a look at some of its key features and components. You can use the Web Configuration utility for a variety of configuration tasks, such as setting up virtual servers, pools, monitors, and secure network address translation, or SNAT. You can also perform monitoring. For example, you can monitor network traffic, current connections, and the operating system itself. In addition, the Web Configuration utility provides convenient access to downloads. For example, you can download the SNMP Management Information Base, or MIB. Now let's take a look at the Web Configuration utility's interface to see where you access the various functions. Notice the navigation panel on the left. Some tabs in this panel change depending on which BIG-IP components you are licensed to use. Several tabs, however, are common to all installations. The tabs in common to all BIG-IP products are Overview, from which you can download documentation and run the setup utility; Templates and Wizards, for creating common configurations; Network, for configuring network routing and switching; and Systems, for backing up your configurations and licensing the system. You'll be hearing more about these different tabs as you move through the course. For now, let's focus on the Local Traffic tab. This tab appears if the BIG-IP is licensed for LTM. The Local Traffic section is where you will configure most LTM features and where you'll be spending most of your time during this course. Finally, as a reminder, you access this configuration utility by opening a web browser and entering HTTPS, followed by the management IP address or one of the self IP addresses of your BIG-IP. You can also configure your BIG-IP using a command line interface, or CLI. You access the CLI through either the BIG-IP serial console or remotely via SSH. We will be focusing on the Web Configuration utility in this course. For more information about using the CLI, see the BIG-IP document titled Traffic Management Shell Reference Guide. You might also consider attending the instructor-led BIG-IP Advanced Topics course at one of F5 Network's many training centers around the world. After configuring the LTM, it's always a good idea to back up the system so that you can return to a known state should something go wrong. BIG-IP backs up its configuration to a User Configuration Set, or UCS file. The UCS file is actually composed of a series of files combined into a single compressed file that can be stored on BIG-IP or downloaded to another system. Note also that the UCS file contains the BIG-IP license. To access or create backup files, select the System tab in the Web Configuration utility, and then select Archives. This opens the Archive screen, from which you can upload existing backup files to BIG-IP or create new backup files. In the hands-on lab exercises associated with this lesson, you will have the opportunity to work with the creation and loading of backup files. Next, let's review the BIG-IP hardware options available and look at the supported software and operating system. This concludes Lesson 4. Before continuing, test your understanding of the content presented in this lesson by answering a few review questions. Lesson 5, Hardware, Software, and Operating System. After completing this lesson, you'll be able to explain the concept of provisioning and why this feature was added to BIG-IP, list and explain the differences between the various BIG-IP hardware platforms, and explain the purpose and basic functionality of the other operating system running on BIG-IP. Provisioning, which was added to BIG-IP in version 10, gives you some control over BIG-IP resources, both CPU and RAM, that are allocated to each licensed module. For example, if you are licensed for both GTM and LTM, and you know that your implementation of GTM will require fewer resources than LTM, you can use provisioning to minimize the resources dedicated to GTM. LTM is provisioned by default, so unless you have purchased additional BIG-IP modules, there's nothing you need to do. Provisioning is mentioned at this point in the course just to make sure that you are aware of the feature. To provision BIG-IP resources, you use the System tab in the Web Configuration utility. There are 4 levels you can set to indicate the resources you want allocated for each module you're licensed to use: Dedicated, Nominal, Minimum, and None. Use Dedicated if only one module is functional on that CPU or on the whole system. Nominal gives the module enough resources for most typical configurations if they're available. Minimum gives the module its minimum functional resources and distributes additional resources to other modules. Use the minimum setting to allow the maximum number of modules to coexist on a system. Use None if you do not want any resources provisioned for that module. F5 Networks offers multiple BIG-IP platforms to fit different traffic needs. All platforms run the same software, but higher-end platforms contain more options and can support more modules simultaneously. The 8900 series comes with symmetrical multiprocessing across 8 cores. It includes 16 gigabytes of RAM, 16 copper Ethernet ports, each with a speed of up to 1 gigabit, 4 fiber ports, and dual power. The 8900 also supports up to 56,000 transactions per second, or TPS, of SSL encryption. The 6900 series comes with symmetrical multiprocessing across 4 cores. It includes 8 gigabytes of RAM, 16 copper Ethernet ports, each with a speed of up to 1 gigabit, 4 fiber ports, and dual power. The 6900 also supports up to 25,000 TPS of SSL encryption. The 3600 series comes with symmetrical multiprocessing across 2 cores. It includes 4 gigabytes of RAM and 8 copper Ethernet ports, each with a speed of up to 1 gigabit. Dual power is an option. The 3600 also supports up to 10,000 TPS of SSL encryption. The 1600 series comes with symmetrical multiprocessing across 2 cores. It includes 4 gigabytes of RAM and 4 gigabit copper Ethernet ports. Dual power is an option. The 1600 also supports up to 5,000 TPS of SSL encryption. Note that the platforms mentioned in this course are current as of August 2009. For the most current information on available platforms, see the F5 Networks website. The most powerful BIG-IP platform is the Viprion, a single controller that uses modular performance blades that you can add or remove without disrupting your applications. A fully loaded Viprion system with 4 blades delivers greater performance and superior functionality than competitive products. Each of the blades includes 2 dual-core processors, 8 gigabytes of RAM, 8 copper Ethernet ports, each with a speed of up to 1 gigabit, 12 gigabit fiber ports, and up to 2 10 gigabit fiber ports. It is important to note that F5 Networks has specifically designed not only the software, but also the hardware as a full proxy networking device. Let's take a quick peek inside a 3600 BIG-IP. All on board we have the processor, which is covered by a shroud for airflow, an SSL accelerator chip, a second operating system, in this case Always On Management, or AOM, which will be explained momentarily, and an integrated switch fabric. There are a few pieces of additional hardware that you can order from F5. A redundant power supply, a FIPS SSL accelerator card, which allows for independently certified secure management and storage of private keys. Note that a FIPS card must be installed at the factory. A small form pluggable, or SFP, and additional RAM. The power supply and fan chassis included with the product are customer replaceable. The table on this slide is provided for reference purposes only. It details for each platform the version of BIG-IP software that is supported. As you can see, this table includes some platforms that were not discussed in the earlier slide. For example, the 5100, 2400, 1000, 520, and 540. These are legacy platforms that do not support the latest version, version 10.x, of the software. As we mentioned just a moment ago, the BIG-IP hardware is actually running two operating systems. The primary BIG-IP operating system is Linux, but the Traffic Management Microkernel, or TMM, is responsible for processing. This concludes Module 1, Initial Setup. You should now be able to name and explain the purpose of all of the components of BIG-IP hardware. Connect to. It is now time for you to put everything that you've learned into practice. By completing the labs associated with this module, you'll solidify the knowledge that you've gained. In the Setup lab, you'll perform the following BIG-IP tasks. Run the Setup utility and configure system access parameters. Access the Web Configuration utility and become familiar with its interface. And back up your BIG-IP configuration. From the lab registration page, you can also access the PDF file that contains the lab instructions. Look for the Module 1 lab. When you have completed the lab, be sure to answer the lab review questions. These are also contained in the PDF. F5 Networks thanks you for attending this web-based training on BIG-IP LTM. In case you are not able to do the lab right away, you may view the video on this slide. It illustrates the lab steps. However, you should still do the lab as soon as possible, as a video is no substitute for hands-on experience. Once again, thank you for your interest in BIG-IP.